Guild Wars 2 is a great game with plenty of activities to get yourself stuck into, so I will always recommend it to those interested in MMOs. Given the approaching Steam release, the game has been playing around with a few changes and additions to the new player experience to hopefully make a more captivating first impression. Now, I am no new player. I've been playing this wonderful game for about 10 years now, so I may not be the target audience for feedback. Despite this, I believe that since I've played Guild Wars 2 since its beta and have experienced other new player changes firsthand, I might have some insight as to what was a more compelling experience. Come along with me as we reflect on the life of Guild Wars 2's early game experience, provide some suggestions, and try to answer the greater question of, is Guild Wars 2 ready to be launched on Steam? Let me start with an aspect of first impressions which I am unsure others think about, this being the weapon the profession starts with when creating your first character. Class skills are highly tied to the weapon you are using in combat, and when you load into the game for the first time, your character is equipped with one weapon that you had no choice over. Throughout the character creation process, you are not really informed about the combat style of your chosen class. Sure, there are blurbs on the bottom of the screen that inform you of the general playstyle, and you pick a cool profession-specific armor, but the rest of the character creation does not inform you on how you will pursue combat or even what type of weapon you will start with. Additionally, some of the weapons that they start the classes off with really subvert classic ideas of what the class will feel like. Let's take Elementalist, for example. A player just starting Guild Wars 2 may be looking to fill that mage-style role and pick an Elementalist. Loading into the game, they may expect to be wielding a weapon that is more typical of a casting style, but they are met with a dagger in their hand and must get up close and personal with enemies. This may seem like a very small detail, but when making a first impression, every little detail matters. And circumventing expectation should be left to a bit later on in the gameplay process. So, what would I like to see adjusted to not only give players more information in regards to the weapons/playstyles, but to also give players more choice? I think having a slide where you choose one of 3 weapons associated with the class would be beneficial. There should be one highlighted as the recommended option with perhaps descriptions about that weapon, or even a little video playing, showing off the skills and spells. Not only would this introduce a newer player to the method of choosing your skills, but it would also inform them of the various playstyles available to the classes. You've completed your character, you watched the beautifully illustrated cinematic introducing your story, and you have now loaded in and oh boy. Now, what I'm about to point out in this section is entirely subjective, like 100,000% subjective, but I would be going against everything I believe to be true about Guild Wars 2's graphics if I did not point this out. The default camera settings for Guild Wars 2. They are ugly. Yeah, I said it and I'll say it again. They are ugly. And in a video about first impressions and in a game that is graphically rich and has a unique art style, the last thing you want to leave a new player with is, what in the hell are these camera settings? The default setup has the camera perched way above your character, leaving your character model to occupy what feels like 1/100th of the screen, while the rest of the scene is filled with indistinguishable conflict and or lower quality weather effects. Granted, these instances, when you first load in, were made well before the game officially released. But wouldn't that further compel you to push the camera up closer to the beautiful character models and effects? Well, regardless of this rhetorical question, I am serious when I say that the default camera position is a huge disservice to the first impression of the game. Now, there might be veterans out there saying, well, KROOF, this camera setup is what I use and it's best for the battlefield experience, so you can see as many things as possible. Well, to that I would say, well, okay, you are absolutely right, but you are also an established player who is playing more intense PvE, PvP, or world versus world, where you have decided you make the biggest impact with that camera setup. For a newer player to Guild Wars 2, they won't be experiencing such rigorous combat where they need to sacrifice the cinematic style of the visuals for the improved combat efficacy. So, what would I suggest to remedy this awful visual? Well, if you had asked me in a context of not presenting this video to the world, I would have the camera punched in as much as possible, as tight as it can be to your character, to really sell the visuals and combat of the game. But I know that my preferences may be seen as extreme in the same way I believe the default camera options are. I believe a nice middle ground approach would be to, well, take the middle ground. The vertical positioning for both near and far are way too high, so I would drop those down a bit. Additionally, I would push in the field of view just a tad to further present the game in a more stylized look. Finally, the zoom scroll speed is set at maximum, which I don't entirely mind as much as the other options, but notching this down just a tad might feel less jarring when you accidentally or intentionally scroll to zoom in or out. Ultimately, with an MMO that is trying to sell the feeling of a world larger than life and one that has grand scales of adventure and conflict, the default camera settings really show the game as being small, minute, and one where all the details get lost in the bigger picture. Now that you have grappled with the camera setup, you can finally move forward on your path of completing the first story mission. Yay, congrats. I find this instance to be perfectly fine in its layout. It's a very beginner-friendly instance. Though, I have recently played through the human starting zone and first mission, and I realized just how quickly everything dies, and how quickly it feels like the threat is resolved. I don't think the mobs or bosses should take ages to kill, but having a bit more gameplay time with that boss, especially, well, that might just make it a little more logical. Additionally, there are a lot of mobs around attacking in the first instance, but you have no reason to help out around the area, and you completely avoid them for the most part. Perhaps having a brief moment of needing to kill 5 or X amount of enemies to quell the threat and then report to the appropriate NPC, maybe that would make it feel more in line with the tone of the setting. Other than this, the bosses of the first instance used to be a little bit deadlier, and I don't think I would be opposed to seeing a little more damage thrown out in a highly telegraphed attack to start showcasing a huge part of gameplay, this being telegraphs. Upon completing the instance, you are freed out into the open world experience, and as a new player, this is where it can feel especially jarring. You have just defeated a larger-than-life boss, are thanked for your heroic deeds, notable characters praise your performance, and then nothing. Absolutely nothing. The story that your character exploded onto the scene with dies before it has even had a chance to write a will. This is where the new player experience really fizzles. In order to pick up on your next story experience, you are told that you have to reach level 10. This is not how Guild Wars 2 used to be. Before they did their large new player revamp back in 2014, story chapters would unlock every 2 to 3 levels and would be noted on the top right of your UI. This gave you a direction in the world, something to work towards and to follow. You could choose to do it under-leveled and experience more of a challenge while gaining XP, or you could level up first in the open world and then choose to tackle it at a more appropriate level. I really enjoyed the way this was set up before the revamp, and I have seen more people become vocal in support of the older format as well. This change might be a greater effort, but I truly believe that this is maybe the biggest issue looming over Guild Wars 2's head, and a current design flaw which could hurt the game's performance on Steam. So ultimately, I would like to see a better pace of the personal story for Guild Wars 2, because it really loses its momentum the minute you begin the adventure. To make a quick comparison with another MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. 14's main story is critiqued for being a bit lengthy and lackluster in its core experience. But the one thing it has going for it is its consistency. There's always a carrot on that stick and a clear narrative line of the game. Guild Wars 2 chops itself into eighths, and while the zones have their own stories, they are extremely easy to miss as they are not done in the way modern maps are structured today. Moving on to a more fun topic. Another system Guild Wars 2 used to have were class trainers, who sold you trait books to further customize your class. I would love to see these trainers return to not just sell specializations and introduce that system, but to also offer little side quests, side class quests, if you will, where you have to interact with the game's mechanics and progressively learn the combat system. From the basics of learning weapon swapping and dodging, learning your class-specific mechanic, the difference between strike damage and condition damage, learning more about healing, barrier, boons, and resurrecting allies, to even learning about defiance bars and group play. Class mentors could be the perfect system to teach new players everything they need to know to play PvE and PvP content effectively. My final note will be on a discussion about the dungeon system. Now, dungeons recently got a lovely update to the tokens that they drop. They have been absorbed into one currency instead of 8 separate ones, which will make it much more understandable for newer players. Though, one of my biggest issues with dungeons, aside from not having a proper queuing system, is that dungeons only begin to unlock at level 30. A level, in my opinion, which is too high to keep players excited. A huge aspect of any MMO is the group content that players can participate in, and in all other MMOs I've played, the dungeon system opens up much earlier on when you compare it to Guild Wars 2. Additionally, because there is no proper PvE tab to go to and find groups, and that the story does not take you to these dungeons, they are often lost in the greater picture. And these dungeons have vital story to the game's core cast of characters. By not doing the story mode of the dungeons, you miss out on a lot of character development and context. In short, I do not believe that dungeons are where they should be if Guild Wars 2 is looking to keep players who are interested in PvE content. What can be done about this? Well, I counted the dungeons and there are 8 of them. Guild Wars 2 has 80 levels, so if I did the math correctly, and note I did not go to college for math, you could have the first dungeon, Ascalon Catacombs, open up to players much earlier at level 10 instead of 30. It would also help the pacing of the later dungeons as they get squished together from level 70 to 80. I believe there are like 4 dungeons that unlock in 10 level spans. Additionally, instead of the personal story being highlighted every 10 levels, that could be the story for the dungeons, categorized as a side story. This would make it clear that there are dungeons for players to do and shine a bigger spotlight on the important story beats within them. As a final fun note, to talk about dungeons, I would love the story modes to grant a lesser amount of Tales of Dungeon Delving, the new dungeon token system, and for those bosses to maybe be buffed in health just a bit. They tend to die way too easily for it to be a worthwhile encounter. So this reflection of the early game of Guild Wars 2 has been one that is both therapeutic and enlightening for me. I understand, and not on a first-hand basis, that there are so many moving parts to any game, especially MMOs, and that not one person can hold all of the answers. But I also understand that it serves no purpose to complain about a product without at least providing constructive feedback or ideas to address those complaints. As a quick summary of everything we've discussed, presented in a list, class transparency/choice could be improved, the actual camera could have better defaults, the first story mission could be slightly longer, just slightly. Class mentors could be a nice solution to teaching players the mechanics of the games, dungeons could be better spaced out to hook players in faster, and finally, the deepest wound in this discussion, the story chapters need to be reined in and tightened as to not let new players lose all their steam and interest in the storyline. Back to where this all started. Do I believe that Guild Wars 2 is currently ready for Steam? I went back and forth on this answer, but to put it bluntly, I don't. I do not believe that Guild Wars 2 presents a strong enough showing to hook in new players, and, more importantly, to keep new players. By all means, the later levels and experience is infinitely better. but the early game does not remotely reflect the quality of modern releases. I see fundamental flaws that need to be addressed, and if I could play Master of the Universe, I would hold off a bit longer before releasing on Steam. Guild Wars 2 is an epic of a game, with an outstanding story, a riveting action combat system that in and of itself is enough of a reason to give it a shot and stick with it, in my opinion. The community surrounding the game sparks joy in my heart, and has blessed me with some of my most tender memories. Thankfully, what this game and most MMOs have going for it is time. All of our ideas surrounding what could be improved upon may end up being remedied later down the road, and that is the beauty of a live service game. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope some of the talking points sparked more thought around the importance of a first impression, and perhaps you even share some of these musings. If you'd like to try or purchase Guild Wars 2, which I highly recommend, you can check out the links in the description below. And if you want to get videos early and some exclusive Discord channel content, head over to the Patreon. And with this, I will catch you all in the next video. Take care, everyone. Mwah.